"The enemy's coming," Victor said, voice hard. "And these engines won't survive another hour of this heat." Kohler stared at him, then at the horizon. The specks were growing larger. He didn't argue. "Get the men ready," he barked. We move east toward the canyon. The camp erupted into motion. Engines roared to life, filling the air with metallic thunder. The tanks, his tanks, rolled forward, each one carrying the weight of his desperation. As they began to move, Victor climbed onto the first Panzer and looked back. The old camp burned behind them, smoke rising like a funeral pyre against the setting sun. He could feel the heat on his face even now. He whispered under his breath, almost to the desert itself. "You tried to kill us, but now you'll carry us." And for the first time in weeks, the tanks didn't stall. They moved, slow, stubborn, alive, carving their way through a sea of fire and sand. But Victor knew this was only the beginning. What waited beyond the dunes would test not his invention, but his soul. The convoy crawled forward, engines moaning like dying beasts. The sand shifted under the treads, each movement a battle. Above them, the sky was a sheet of white heat, so bright it hurt to look at. The air shimmered with invisible fire. The smell of oil, dust, and sweat blended into one choking haze. Victor sat half-hanging from the turret of the lead tank, eyes narrowed against the glare. His improvised cooling systems were holding for now. Thin copper tubes glistened under the sunlight, wrapped in rags that hissed softly as water evaporated from them. The tanks were alive but barely. Each one ran like a man on his last breath. Behind him, Kohler barked orders. "Keep the line tight. Don't stop for anything. If one stalls, we push it." The men obeyed, faces burnt and cracked from days in the furnace. Their lips bled when they shouted. Dust coated their teeth. Every heartbeat felt heavier than the last. Hours passed and the dunes began to change shape. The desert was shifting, like a living creature trying to swallow them whole. Somewhere behind, a black column of smoke marked what was left of the camp they'd abandoned. "Water check," Kohler called. The reply came weakly from the rear. 3 canisters left. Victor gritted his teeth. "Ration it. Every drop." The tanks groaned, the cooling systems leaking in small hisses. He knew they were dying again one by one. The miracle was fading. Suddenly, the second tank in line jolted and stopped. The engine spat black smoke. The driver screamed, "Pressure drop! She's boiling over!" Victor jumped down before Kohler could order him. He ran through the sand, boots sinking deep, lungs burning. The metal of the stalled tank was so hot it shimmered. He climbed up, ripped open the hatch, and disappeared inside. Inside the turret, it was like stepping into an oven. Steam and the stench of oil filled the air. He coughed violently, grabbed the side pipe, and listened to the hissing. He felt it, air pockets overheating, a blockage in the coil. "Give me the canister," he yelled. A soldier handed him one of the last water bottles. Without hesitation, Victor poured it straight into the condenser tube. The metal hissed violently, releasing a cloud of steam that burned his face. But the gauge started to move. The temperature dropped slightly. "Start her!" he shouted. The driver turned the crank. The engine coughed, groaned, and finally came alive again. Cheers erupted outside, short and hoarse. Victor leaned against the wall, coughing hard, half blind from the smoke. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. The burns on his forearms had turned white. But he didn't care. The tank was alive. He climbed out, face pale, eyes hollow. Kohler met him halfway. "You keep doing this, you'll burn yourself to death." Victor gave a faint, exhausted smile. "Then I'll burn doing something that works." The sergeant looked away. "Get back on your machine." We moved till night. By sunset, the desert had turned red. Shadows stretched across the sand like scars. The convoy reached the edge of a shallow canyon, dry, cracked earth scattered with dead shrubs. It wasn't much, but it offered cover. The tanks circled into a defensive line. When the engines finally went silent, the men dropped where they stood, too tired to eat or speak. The only sound was the faint ticking of metal cooling down. Victor sat against his tank, head tilted back, eyes closed. The copper pipes still gleamed faintly, dripping what little moisture they could. He could hear the faint heartbeat of the machine, a steady, rhythmic pulse of air through the condenser. It reminded him of breathing. He opened his eyes and stared at the horizon. Faint flashes of light flickered in the distance, artillery maybe 30 kilometers away. The war hadn't stopped. It was just waiting. Klaus approached quietly, carrying a dented canteen. "Sir, you should drink." Victor shook his head. Give it to the driver. He's asleep, Klaus said softly. Then pour it into the engine, Victor replied. It needs it more than I do. The young soldier hesitated, then nodded and walked away. The night grew darker, colder. Stars burned above them, sharp, distant, merciless. The men slept on the sand, wrapped in thin blankets. Victor couldn't sleep. His mind was still racing, drawing invisible diagrams in the air. There had to be a better way, a permanent fix. Something beyond rags and desperation. He tore a page from his notebook, scribbling sketches of pressure loops and condensation traps. His hand shook too much to keep the lines straight. He whispered to himself, if water can be made from air, then air can be made to feed water. It didn't even make sense anymore, but he clung to the thought like a prayer. A distant rumble broke the silence. At first he thought it was thunder. Then he heard it clearly, engines. Not theirs. He crawled up the ridge, eyes straining in the moonlight. Far across the dunes, a line of small, flickering lights moved toward them, British armor. He slid back down and woke Kohler. They're coming, he said simply. The sergeant's eyes widened. How many? Too many. Kohler exhaled slowly. Then we hold till dawn. Victor looked back at his tanks, patched together with scraps and faith. He knew they wouldn't survive another battle. Not without help. Not without a miracle. The first shells landed minutes later, lighting the canyon in bursts of orange and white. Sand rained from the cliffs. The men shouted, diving for cover. Engines roared back to life, trembling like hearts under strain. And as the first line of British tanks appeared over the dunes, Victor climbed onto his machine again, whispering under his breath, Come on, breathe for me. Just breathe. The desert answered with fire. The first shell tore into the canyon wall, sending a wave of sand over the tanks. Men shouted, diving for cover as rocks and dust rained down. The night was no longer silent, it was chaos, filled with the thunder of artillery and the metallic scream of ricocheting rounds. The ground itself seemed to tremble with every hit. Victor was already moving before the second blast came. He leapt down from the tank, ran to the next one and checked the lines. The condensation coils hissed, still alive but straining. Heat readings spiked across all the dials. His cooling system was at its breaking point. A soldier yelled, They're closing in. 10, maybe 15 tanks, Kohler shouted back. Hold your ground. Fire at will. The first German shell roared into the distance, followed by the thunderous boom of impact. The flash lit up the canyon for a second. Then another blast answered from the British side, closer this time. Victor wiped the sweat and soot from his face. He climbed back into the lead tank, shouting orders to the crew. Keep the vents open. If they clog, we'll cook alive. The driver nodded, terrified, his face glistening with oil and fear. The gunner reloaded, hands trembling. Victor looked at the gauges. One needle was already deep in the red. Come on, he whispered. Don't die now. Outside, the sound of tracks grinding over sand grew louder. The enemy was in range. Muzzle flashes strobed the darkness like lightning. The desert night became a storm of fire. Kohler's voice echoed through the chaos. Forward! Don't let them flank. The tanks lurched ahead, engines roaring, sand exploding beneath their treads. Victor's creation, the impossible cooling hack, was holding just barely. Steam rose from the coils like ghosts. The tanks looked alive, monstrous, sweating metal beasts charging into the dark. Then a hit. The tank behind Victor's burst into flames, the blast shaking the air. Men screamed. A figure ran out, engulfed, falling to the ground in silence. Victor's throat closed. He wanted to stop, to help, but he couldn't. If he did, they'd all die. He gripped the side rail until his knuckles bled and shouted, Keep firing. The lead gun roared again, the recoil slamming through his chest. The shell hit true. An enemy tank exploded in a pillar of light and smoke. For a heartbeat, the canyon flashed bright as day. Direct hit. Someone screamed. Victor exhaled shakily. Good, he muttered. Now again, but his relief was short. The temperature gauges began to spike again, coolant pressure failing. The tubes glowed faintly red, overworked. He could smell burning cloth, hear the hiss of steam turning dry. He tore off his glove and reached for the valve, twisting it open. The scalding vapor hit his arm, burning flesh instantly. He didn't flinch. He held it until the needle dropped. Pressure stable, the gunner said, voice breaking. Victor slumped back, clutching his arm. Outside, the sound of retreat horns cut through the air. The British were pulling back. The men cheered weakly, some laughing, some crying. The desert didn't kill with bullets. It killed slowly, with heat that peeled paint from steel and hope from men. By noon, the 8th Armored Division had become a graveyard of tanks, each one coughing out its last breath of smoke before dying under the merciless African sun. When their engines failed, so did the line. But under one of those smoldering beasts, a lone engineer refused to run. His uniform was soaked in oil and sweat, his fingers blistered and trembling. His name was Victor Hahn, a man once known for designing locomotives in Dresden, now kneeling in the sand surrounded by the dying roar of machines. Everyone else had given up. The officers called it hopeless. The manuals called it impossible. But Victor whispered something else under his breath. Metal can't think, but I can. The desert didn't feel like Earth anymore. It felt like another planet, one built entirely out of heat and silence. The ground shimmered like liquid glass. Boots sank into sand so hot it burned through the soles. Dead flies floated in pools of melted oil beneath the tanks. The air smelled of rust, sweat, and despair. By noon, half the division had stopped moving. Tanks that were supposed to be unstoppable beasts of war now sat frozen in place, coughing out black smoke before dying altogether. Men leaned against their armor, too weak to curse, too dehydrated to speak. The desert had beaten them without firing a single bullet. One tank near the edge of the formation suddenly roared, then exploded with a hiss of steam. Its cooling system burst open like a wound. The crew jumped out screaming, their uniforms soaked with boiling water. The cries echoed across the camp before fading into the sound of the wind. Victor Hahn stood there watching in silence. He was 32, thin, his uniform stained dark with oil. Once in Dresden, he'd designed engines that ran like symphonies, precise, balanced, alive. Now, he watched his creations die one after another under the sun. He pressed his hand against the steel hull of the nearest Panzer. The metal burned his skin instantly. He didn't pull away. He whispered, "It's not the machine's fault." Sergeant Kohler stomped toward him, voice hoarse and furious. "They're dying, Hahn. Every damn tank. What's wrong with them?" "The desert," Victor said quietly. "The air's too dry. The coolant can't circulate. It evaporates before it even works." Kohler stared at him in disbelief. "Then make it stop. Do something." Victor looked down at the sand swirling around his boots. "You can't fight the sun," he said softly. Kohler leaned in close, his face inches away. "Then maybe you shouldn't be here," he spat, and stormed off, leaving Victor alone with the dying machines. That night, the camp turned silent. The soldiers no longer joked. Some tore open ration cans and ate in silence. Others just lay on the sand, staring up at the stars that didn't care. The only sound was the faint hiss of steam leaking from broken tanks. Victor sat apart from the others, a small lamp flickering beside him. He opened his field notebook, the pages stiff from heat and dust. Every calculation, every airflow equation ended in the same word scrawled across the bottom: failure. He tore the page out, crumpled it, and tossed it aside. The next page was blank. He stared at it until the light began to fade. Then he wrote, "If the air kills us, make the air save us." He looked up. The wind moved across the dunes like an invisible wave. He remembered the factory back home, the turbines he'd built to recycle steam into water. Condensation chambers, pressure loops, coolant recovery systems, machines that breathed their own air. His eyes narrowed. Maybe that's what he needed to build. Not a cooling system, but a lung. He stood, grabbed his tools, and headed for the junk pile. The guards didn't stop him. No one cared anymore. He scavenged what he could: copper pipes, broken tubing, rags from the medical tent, even parts from a destroyed generator. By dawn, he was still working. A mechanic walked by and laughed weakly. "You gone mad, Hahn?" "Maybe," Victor said, not looking up. "But madness works better than silence." He twisted copper tubing into a crude spiral, feeding it through the engine vents, wrapping wet cloth around the intake. It looked ridiculous, like a wounded beast wrapped in bandages, but he wasn't trying to make it pretty. He was trying to make it breathe. When he poured the last of the coolant into the improvised loop, the others watched in uneasy silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine coughed once, twice, and came alive with a deep, steady growl. The temperature gauge dropped by 2 degrees. Then 3, a murmur spread through the men. Someone whispered, "He did it." Victor didn't celebrate. He simply stared at the trembling needle and said under his breath, "It's only the beginning." Above them, the sun rose again, brighter than before. The heat returned. But this time, one machine was still breathing. The morning sun climbed higher, blinding and merciless. Every breath felt like inhaling from a furnace. The men squinted against the light, eyes raw and red from sand and sleeplessness. Somewhere in the distance, engines still groaned and sputtered like dying animals. But one, only one, kept running. The tank Victor had rebuilt the night before stood out like a survivor among corpses. Its engine purred weakly but steady. The cooling hack was working, barely yet miraculously. The makeshift copper coils gleamed under the sunlight, dripping condensation that steamed before it touched the sand. To the men, it looked like the thing was sweating, as if the tank itself had come alive. Private Klaus leaned in, eyes wide. "How the hell is that possible?" Victor's voice was cracked from thirst. "It's not perfect," he muttered, "but it buys time. The vapor cools the intake. The engine breathes cooler air." Sergeant Kohler arrived, disbelief hardening into irritation. "You think one machine makes a difference? We've got 40 tanks dead in the sand." Victor stood, wiping grease across his sleeve. "Then give me 4 hours in silence." Kohler wanted to shout, but something in Victor's eyes, fevered, determined, stopped him. He turned and barked orders. "Fine, you heard him." No interruptions. "Anyone touches that tank dies before sundown." The others laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. It wasn't. Victor bent back down and began sketching on the sand with a wrench, tracing air loops and pressure lines. The plan looked insane. To rebuild the cooling systems of multiple tanks using salvaged parts without proper coolant, under 50 degrees of burning heat. He didn't care. Logic had no place left in this war. As the day burned on, Victor moved from one machine to the next, sweat and sand turning his face into a mask. He stole tubing from wrecks, stripped copper from radios, even drained leftover water from the medic tents. Every drop counted. The soldiers gathered around him, curious, half-believing. "Why's he still doing this?" one of them whispered. "We'll all be dead before nightfall." "Because it's the only thing left to do," another replied. By late afternoon, 3 tanks were running, barely but alive. Victor's hack worked like a fragile heartbeat. It couldn't last long, but it gave them a chance to move. The desert wind picked up again, blowing sand into every crevice, and Victor felt his lungs tighten. He hadn't eaten since the day before. His vision blurred, but his mind raced faster than ever. He crawled under another hull, hands trembling. The metal scalded his palms. A hose burst beside his head, spraying a hiss of steam that burned through his sleeve. He screamed but didn't stop. "Not yet," he growled through clenched teeth. "You don't die yet." Then an explosion ripped through the camp. The ground shook. A plume of sand shot into the air like a geyser. Soldiers dove for cover. Kohler shouted something, but the words were lost in the noise. A nearby fuel truck had overheated and detonated, setting 2 other tanks ablaze. Flames danced high, painting the dunes orange. Victor staggered to his feet, coughing smoke. His ears rang. The sky above shimmered with heat and chaos. For a second, he thought it was over. Then he saw it. The fire spreading toward the line of repaired tanks, the only ones that could still move. His work, his hope, everything. Without thinking, he ran straight toward the fire. Someone shouted his name, but he didn't turn. He grabbed a tarp, soaked it in coolant, and threw it over the nearest tank's fuel port. The flames licked at the edges, but the engine remained untouched. The cloth hissed and smoked. The smell of burning chemicals thickened the air. His arms trembled. The heat was unbearable. But when he looked down, he saw something that stopped his breath. The condensation coils on the first tank, the one he'd built last night, were collecting droplets again. Real water. He froze. Then a wild idea struck him like lightning. He pulled a tube free, jammed one end into a cracked radiator, and watched. The vapor turned to liquid almost instantly. The engine temperature began to drop. It wasn't just working, it was regenerating itself. The men gathered, staring in disbelief. "Is that water?" Klaus whispered. Victor nodded slowly. "It's the desert's breath," he said hoarsely. "We're stealing it back." For the first time in days, laughter broke through the heat. Short, ragged, but real. The men shouted, clapped him on the back, called him a genius. Kohler even cracked a smile, but Victor didn't smile. He looked out at the horizon, where heat waves shimmered like ghosts. In the distance, faint black specks moved, enemy armor. The British were advancing, slow but steady. He felt the weight of it settle in his gut. The miracle wasn't a victory. It was a warning. He turned to Kohler. We have to move now, Kohler blinked. What are you talking about? He climbed out of the hatch, looking across the desert. Fires dotted the dunes, black smoke twisting into the starless sky. Bodies and twisted metal lay scattered across the sand. Kohler limped toward him, face streaked with ash. You did it, Han, you crazy bastard. You kept them alive. Victor looked at the tanks, steam still hissing from their vents like beasts still breathing after the fight. He didn't smile. No, he said quietly. They did it. They breathed when we couldn't. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of burning oil and iron. In the distance, the faint rumble of engines began again. The battle wasn't over. It had only paused to catch its breath, just like them. And as dawn crept over the dunes, the engineer stood between death and machine, surrounded by the monsters he'd kept alive with nothing but faith, fire, and a handful of stolen air. The battle ended before sunrise, but the silence that followed felt heavier than war itself. Smoke still hung in the canyon, thick and bitter. The tanks stood half buried in sand, their metal cooling with faint clicks like dying heartbeats. Men moved slowly among the wrecks, limping, dragging, whispering names that no one answered to. Victor Hahn sat on the ground, his back against a scorched track wheel, his left arm bandaged in rags that smelled of burnt flesh. The world around him was blurred by exhaustion. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw fire. The British retreat had saved them for now, but it was a hollow victory. The tanks that had survived were broken beyond repair, and those still running were bleeding coolant faster than he could replace it. Sergeant Kohler approached quietly, limping, his uniform torn. You should get that looked at, he said, nodding toward Victor's arm. Victor shook his head. No doctors left. They went with the wounded at dawn. Kohler crouched beside him, running a hand over the sand. We lost 27 men last night, but we held the canyon. Command will call that a win. A win? Victor said softly. Look around you, Sergeant. The desert always wins. Kohler didn't answer. He stared out at the dunes where the horizon shimmered like a mirage. They'll send us orders soon. Probably want us to move east again. Victor laughed, a sound without joy. East, the engines won't make it 5 kilometers. Kohler smiled faintly. Then you'll make them. Victor didn't respond. He looked at his tanks, the breathing machines he had forced to live when everything else had died. Each one was streaked with soot and sand, the cooling coils twisted, leaking, blackened by heat. They were alive, yes, but only barely, like the men who drove them. He pushed himself up, ignoring the pain that flared through his arm. Get me tubing. Any metal you can find, even broken parts. I can reroute the coolant system, maybe extend the loop. Kohler hesitated. You need rest. Victor turned to him, eyes sunken but burning. Rest doesn't win wars. The sergeant nodded. Then we'll get you what you need. By noon, the camp was alive again, not with energy, but with desperation. The men scavenged through debris, dragging broken pipes, damaged radiators, even pieces of aircraft wrecks. Victor oversaw everything, his notebook open, sketches drawn with trembling hands. He wasn't rebuilding anymore. He was reinventing. He remembered something his father once told him. Engines are like people. They need to breathe, to cool, and to rest. But there was no rest here. Not for man or machine. Victor built a new system, one that combined the remnants of his condensation idea with a sand filter from a destroyed generator. The design was insane. The coils were shaped like lungs, 2 chambers pulling air through a layer of soaked sand that cooled it before feeding it into the engine. It was crude, ugly, and barely functional, but in theory it could keep them moving longer. When he finished attaching the final valve, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. His lips were cracked, bleeding. He poured the last of the water into the filter and sealed it. The tank groaned, shuddered, then exhaled, a deep, wet hiss of vapor. He stepped back and stared. The air coming out of the vent was cold. The men gathered around, eyes wide. Is it working? Klaus asked. Victor nodded slowly. For now. They cheered weakly but genuinely. Kohler clapped him on the shoulder. You've done it again. But Victor didn't smile. He was staring at the wet sand dripping from the vent, glistening like sweat. It wasn't victory. It was survival, temporary, fragile, cruel. Hours passed. The tanks idled, holding their fragile equilibrium. Victor finally allowed himself to sit. He stared at his notebook again, flipping through pages covered in equations, sketches, and burned fingerprints. Somewhere deep inside, the engineer in him, the man who loved machines more than metals, felt a flicker of pride. Then he heard it, a faint rumble. At first he thought it was thunder, but there hadn't been clouds in weeks. He looked up. Over the ridge to the west, dust plumes rose, dozens of them. Kohler shouted from the lookout. "They're back!" British recon column, maybe 50 vehicles. The men scrambled into position. The tanks rumbled to life one after another, their new cooling systems hissing like angry serpents. Victor climbed onto his machine, ignoring the pain in his arm. He could feel it. This time the engines were ready. He shouted over the roar, "Keep formation! Let the wind hit the vents, use the desert's breath." The men followed his commands without question. The tanks moved out of the canyon, forming a line across the dunes. From a distance, they looked like a fleet of living beasts rising from the sand. The British armored column appeared soon after, sun glinting off their turrets, moving fast, confident. Victor leaned forward and whispered to his engine, "Come on, my friend." One last time. The desert wind shifted. The coils hissed and steamed. The first shells flew, cutting the sky apart. The second battle for the canyon had begun, and as fire spread once more across the endless dunes, Victor Hahn realized something terrifying and beautiful at once. He wasn't fighting for victory anymore. He was fighting to prove that man could make even the desert itself breathe. The battle roared to life faster than the last. Sand turned black from explosions, the air thick with smoke and dust. The tanks advanced like wounded animals, each one trembling but alive. Victor's modified cooling system hissed under pressure, condensation dripping in silver trails across the metal. Shells screamed overhead. One tank to his left was hit, its turret torn apart in a bloom of fire. Men screamed, then vanished in the smoke. Victor didn't look away. He shouted to the driver, "Forward! Don't stop or the engine dies." They surged through the haze, gunfire flashing through the smoke. Each vibration felt like a heartbeat. The desert, the machines, the men, everything pulsed together in one rhythm. Victor saw another tank overheating ahead, its vents clogged with sand. Without thinking, he climbed out mid-movement, leaping onto the moving vehicle. The heat burned his boots, his coat caught fire, but he tore open the vents, scraping sand out with his bare hands. His skin blistered instantly, but he didn't stop until the air hissed again and the engine roared back to life. Kohler's voice echoed faintly through the radio. "They're breaking. Keep pushing." Through the smoke, Victor saw the enemy line falter, engines failing, retreating under the relentless sun. For the first time he felt it. The desert itself was on their side. Then came a final explosion behind him, a blast so strong it threw him into the sand. His vision blurred. The sound faded until all he could hear was the whisper of the wind. He looked up, the world spinning, and saw his tank still moving through the dunes, alive, breathing, unstoppable. A weak smile crossed his burned lips. "Good," he whispered. "Just keep breathing." And as darkness closed in, the desert exhaled one final sigh of victory. The wind had changed by dawn. It no longer howled, it carried silence heavy and infinite. The battle was over. The dunes were littered with blackened armor, twisted tracks, and the faint glint of brass shells half buried in the sand. Smoke drifted like ghosts across the horizon. The desert had swallowed everything again. Sergeant Kohler limped through the wreckage, coughing through the dust. His uniform was torn, face streaked with ash. Around him, the survivors worked in silence, dragging bodies, checking for life where there was none. Every step left a deep print in the sand that the wind quickly erased. "Where's Hahn?" someone asked quietly. No one answered. Kohler scanned the field, eyes narrowing. The sun had just started to rise, an orange disk bleeding over the dunes. Then he saw it, one tank still running. The engine hummed weakly, smoke curling from its vents. It stood alone at the edge of the battlefield, facing east. He walked toward it, step by step. The closer he came, the more he saw. The copper coil still dripping moisture, the sand around it damp. The tank was alive, but Victor wasn't. He lay half buried beside the treads, one hand still resting on the steel as if he had fallen mid-repair. His face was calm, eyes closed, lips curved in the faintest trace of a smile. The desert wind brushed over him softly like it finally understood what he had done. Kohler knelt beside him, staring for a long time. "You mad, brilliant bastard," he murmured. "You made it breathe." He reached up and touched the tank's hull, still warm, still alive. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was Victor's heartbeat made of iron and steam. When the recovery convoy arrived days later, they found the canyon eerily quiet. Only one tank still worked. Its cooling coils gleamed under the sun, wet with condensation. A small note was pinned to its side in Victor's handwriting, barely legible through soot and sand. If the air kills us, make the air save us. They never moved the tank again. Instead, they left it there, half buried by the dunes, still humming faintly as if refusing to die. And so the desert remembered him. Not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as the man who taught it to breathe.